Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start with a very warm welcome on an exceptionally warm day here in Brussels. And my name is Laura Sullivan. I'm going to be your moderator for the next hour. And I'm delighted to tell you that we're talking about the brand new report, Fashion's Plastic Paralysis, from Changing Markets and Partners. So Changing Markets, in case you do not know them, work to expose irresponsible practices and drive change towards a more sustainable economy. They partner up with all kinds of organizations, NGOs, foundations, research organizations to run campaigns that try to shift market share away from unsustainable practices and products and companies and towards a more truly environmentally and socially just solutions. There are 4 organizations that have partnered up with them on writing this report: Fashion Revolution, No Plastic in My Sea, Plastic Soup Foundation, and the Clean Clothes Campaign. Now, to get to the subject matter, fashion is something that touches everything and everyone. It reflects trends and innovations and really how we live. So there is growing concern about the fashion industry's increasing reliance on synthetic materials, which are essentially forms of plastic from polyester to nylon that are dominating the market, essentially because they're cheap and versatile and the easy option. But the easy option has a cost, and dependence on plastic and fossil fuel-based fashion has serious environmental and health implications. Microplastics that come from synthetics shed from our clothes and end up everywhere, from the ocean to food to our bodies. Luckily, there are other options and change is still possible. So today we're looking at 3 things. First, we'll be going to Urška from Changing Markets, Senior Campaign Manager there, and she'll be giving us a rundown of the report and particularly the trends in the fashion industry when it comes to synthetics. We'll then go over to Professor Dr. Barbara Melgert from the University of Groningen, on the impacts of plastic-based fashion on our health and really the sort of pervasive presence of microplastics. Finally, we'll also hear from Emily McIntosh, Senior Policy Officer for Textiles at the European Environmental Bureau, on opportunities for change through legislation. Our last section will be to go over to you. And I should say, and I'm sure people are curious, who are you? We have almost 200 people on this webinar from all over the world, from NGOs, movements, specific campaigns, from member states, the UNDP, foundations, students, and a number of professors. Now, I want to ask you 2 things. You'll notice that you have a chat or a Q&A box. I would like you to use that, if you would agree, during this event. You can add questions at any point. If you already have something you're curious about in relation to the report, you can drop your question in now. But you can also wait to hear from the speakers and address questions specifically to them. Within that request, there is another request, which is the shorter and sharper you keep those questions, the more questions we can address and the more people we can hear. So that would be really appreciated. The other ask is, in the spirit of an open conversation, we'd love if you can say who you are when you pose the question, or you can change the title that you have there by your that you have at the top right. In fact, all of our speakers have already done that. So the best thing is just to perhaps say your name and your organization if you come from one when you put your question down. So that's it on the housekeeping. I'm going to now go over to Urška from Changing Markets, who's going to speak to us for about the next 10 minutes on the trends in the industry. Urška, it's great to have you there, and I'm really looking forward to listening and learning from you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the introduction. So just give me a second. So I share my screen so you can all see the presentation. I hope that works. Can you give me a signal if it's working fine? Great. Okay. So thank you, Laura, and thank you to everyone that joined our webinar today. My name is Urshka. I'm a senior campaign manager at the Changing Markets Foundation. And before I go into the findings of our recent Fashion's Plastic Paralysis report, I just want to take a few minutes to explain why we are talking about synthetics today and why our fossil fashion campaign specifically highlights their impacts. Because we have many fibers that are used in the fashion and wider textile industries that carry different levels of environmental and social impacts. But synthetics, deserve sort of stand out for a few key reasons. Some of them Laura already highlighted. And first of all, synthetics such as polyester, nylon, elastan, they're made from fossil fuels. So fashion's increasing reliance on synthetics also means fashion industry's increasing reliance on fossil fuels. There are also essentially plastic-based fibers, and the textile sector is already the third biggest user of plastic today. So in other words, synthetic-based clothing does provide a lifeline for the fossil fuel and plastic industries. Synthetics, especially polyester, have also become the driving force behind the fast fashion model. Polyester is today the most used fiber. It accounts for around 57% of all fiber we use, and it costs about half as much per kilo as cotton. And this is why it also allows the fashion industry to flood the market with low quality, cheap, and disposable clothing. And this is why also polyester, in many cases, has become the go-to fiber for fast fashion brands. We can see this in full scale here on the right side of the graph, where in pink you see that polyester not only accounts for the biggest chunk of today's fiber production, but also almost all of the fiber growth in the past 20 years. So we are currently at the stage where almost 70% of our textiles are made from plastic-based fibers. And what this means is that when we're done with fashion, that means a lot of plastic waste. So how do I now move to the next one? No, I'm sorry, this is turning out to be so, oh la la.
Push the arrow down.
Yeah, I couldn't do it. Now it's a problem again, right? So anyway, this is the end of life of fashion. I think you've all seen many reports already, but this is from our own investigation in Kenya from last year, where we went on the ground to see what happens with used clothing once we're done with it. And what we found is that 1 in 3 pieces of used clothing exported is in fact plastic waste, because it's of such a low quality that it cannot be resold and it contains synthetic fibers. So what it happens to them is they are landfilled, incinerated, or dumped in nature, where we can see, for example, here they're spreading to the Nairobi River. So the impacts on the environment and communities in the global south is substantial. But it's not only, the dumped clothing that is causing plastic pollution, but also the microplastics they shed throughout the entire life cycle of clothes. When we wear them, when we wash them, and when we throw them away. In fact, 35% of microplastics found in the ocean today come from synthetic fibers, and also they are being recognized increasingly as a health risk because they're found all over in our bodies, in our lung tissue, our brain, our placentas of unborn babies, breast milk, and so forth. That this link, now I can, sorry, it's a bit tricky. The link between fast fashion and synthetics and also its impact on microplastic has been widely recognized, not only by scientists, but also policymakers. For example, what you read here is the text from the European Commission's textile strategy, which kind of sets the basis for the upcoming legislation. And they do acknowledge that synthetics are a problem and need to be addressed. sorry, a bit manual here. And here is the report from an industry body called Textile Exchange that published The Future of Synthetics, which also urges the industry to move away from the use of fossil fuel-based polyester and also polyester made from plastic bottles. So for sure, there is already an open acknowledgement of the issue here. The question is just if the fashion brands are getting the memo. So this is the third survey that we have done in the past few years. This year we have reached out to 50 of the biggest global fashion brands to ask them about how much synthetics they use and what are their policies to deal with microplastics at the end of life. And here is some sort of categorization or ranking, if you like, which from which you can see that most of the brands, 45 out of 50, ended up in the bottom two categories because they had little to no transparency about how much synthetics they use, or they had high or increasing use of synthetics in their production. What was really concerning this year is that 54% of companies didn't want to answer our survey, which is a huge increase from just a few years back when only 17% did not respond. So we can assume that increasingly fashion brands do not want to disclose their reliance on synthetic fibers. We did have two brands here in the green circle that have made commitments to phase down and phase out their use of synthetics. These are Reformation and Hugo Boss. Now to have a closer look of what the reliance on synthetic actually looks like. Here on the right-hand side, we have synthetic as a percentage of total fiber, and on the left side, the volumes that the brands use. And you can see that for Shein is right on the top for having almost 82% of their products made from synthetic fibers. And this is already a 10% increase from the year before. And it's followed by Boohoo with 69%, Lululemon 67%, both of brands that have also increased their percentages in the past years. And then on the left side, you see that Inditex, so the parent company of Zara, Bershka, Pull&Bear, and so forth, reported the highest volumes of synthetics. But we need to keep in mind that many companies didn't want to actually disclose the volumes, including Shein, for which we can assume that would be right on the top of that table. So now, if we had proper transparency in the fashion sector, the numbers would probably be even more alarming, but unfortunately, most brands didn't want to share their numbers. But half of them that responded admitted to increasing their use of synthetics in the past year, while only 3 admitted to decreasing it. So it is safe to say that the fashion industry's reliance on synthetics is growing. So in light of this, we also ask brands what are their policies to deal with the microplastic pollution that the clothes they produce cause. And although 88% of brands acknowledge that microplastics are an environmental problem, most of the solutions or policies that they introduce are distract and delay tactics. I want to give you just a few examples of what we have seen based on the responses from the survey. So many of them were saying that they're dealing with the microplastic pollution problem by joining a multi-stakeholder or green initiatives. Although, signing up to an initiative does not guarantee meaningful action on its own. For example, 21 out of 50 companies said they are signatories to the Microfiber Consortium, but none of the signatories actually committed to reduce or phase out synthetics, and 5 of those signatories admitted to be increasing their use of synthetics. So it can be sort of, a smokescreen that gives an illusion that they're taking action while maintaining status quo. Many brands said we need more research before we actually take action or develop policies on microplastics, more research on the impacts of microplastics, and more and a standardized method to measure microfiber release. And it's true that we do need more independent bodies coming up with more better test methods. But again, this is a delay tactic because we do have enough evidence about microplastic pollution now to have proper policies in place. Then 82% of companies said they're dealing with the problem of synthetics by shifting to recycled polyester. And needless to say that, this solution does nothing to actually solve the microplastic problem, because if I'm wearing a dress made from recycled polyester, this will also shed microplastics. And then others were namely suggesting consumer fixes, such as installing washing machine filters, which is also a way to shift responsibility to consumers. So the key takeaways from our report are that, there's a very concerning trend in the fashion industry that shows that despite the fact that we have this increasing environmental and health evidence about the danger of synthetics, the fashion industry is increasing their use of synthetics. And not just that, their policies and strategies are mostly smoke and mirrors. Also, what we want to say is that if we want to properly actually address this issue of microplastic and synthetics, we need policymakers to step in and come up with proper measures on dealing with this issue. Luckily, we have also Emily here that will present some of the opportunities in the upcoming legislation. And yeah, I will wrap up at this point, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and just want to say as well that I want to invite everyone to take a look at our report, which is available on our website. Thank you, and sorry for the technical difficulties. I was a bit rushing through to not take too much of other speakers' time. So I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Thank you, Urška. And I'm pretty sure that anyone who has ever given a presentation in their life or had to deal with tech was feeling a lot of empathy for you. You did a great job. It was super clear. So thank you for that. Now, we've heard from Urška on where the industry stands, quite a lot of worrying stuff there. I would like now to go over to Professor Dr. Barbara Melgert on, well, if these are the consequences, what... Or rather, if this is what is happening, if we keep going like this, really, what are the consequences? So over to you, Professor Dr. Melgert.
Thank you. Let's see if I can share without problems now. All right. Tell me, is it working? I guess so. I don't hear anybody complaining.
It's looking good.
Okay, great. So good afternoon. So my name is Barbara Melgert, and I'm a professor at the University of Groningen, but I'm also part of a big consortium in the Netherlands called Momentum, which investigate health effects of microplastics. Now, my group specializes in the lung, so we investigate health effects on the lung. And today I will discuss some data on microplastics in the air and what they could possibly do to our lungs. So Urška just mentioned that textiles are a major source of microplastics, but they're also a major component in the air. We often focus on water contamination, but abrasion of fabrics, of the things that we wear, that we sit on, can release up to 540 times more fibers than washing alone. And in fact, indoor air microplastic concentrations are significantly higher than outdoor, and we spend most of our time indoors. About 90% of our time is spent indoors, so we have a lot of time for exposure there. So these airborne fibers may therefore be the most concerning. So When it comes to inhaling microplastics, because for it to have an effect, you need to inhale it, the size is crucial. So the larger particles get stuck in the nose and the higher up in the windpipe. But if the particles or the fibers get smaller, they can reach deeper into our lungs. So particles or fibers below 10 micrometer can get into these airways. And if they become smaller than 5 micrometer, they can go all the way down to the smallest structures in our lungs, called the air sacs, and that's where the gas exchange takes place. So these microplastics can affect our health in several ways. First of all, there is the issue of particle toxicity. When cells engulf these fibers, this can lead to inflammation. And secondly, many plastics contain harmful additives, which can lead to additional health risks. And finally, and I'll read that out for a reason, microplastics can absorb other pollutants from the environment and increase our exposure to toxins. But I will focus on the first two because there's not a lot of data on the third one for human health. So if we're talking about particle or fiber toxicity, then when you inhale fibers, it can cause toxicity through inflammation. Immune cells in our lungs or in the other part of our body eat these particles and trigger an immune response. And over time, this sustained inflammation can lead to tissue damage and an increase in the risk of diseases like COPD and lung cancer when we're talking about the lung. So this is a well-known fact for many types of fibers and particles. So we know this happens with cotton, silica dust, wood dust. So plastics do not seem to be very special in this regard, but dose is an important factor here. If we keep on producing plastic and making this plastic pollution, our exposure to these particles will increase. So dose will increase. So that will give us more problems. So when we're talking about the chemicals in plastics, we know that plastics contain chemicals that can cause disease in humans, such as bisphenols, phthalates, PFAS. Now, these chemicals can leach out and also cause additional toxicity. So what do we actually know about the health effects of textile microplastics? So most of the data we have is from occupational exposures of people working in the textile or in the flocking industry before they started wearing protective gear. And up to 40% of the employees in these industries were found to develop respiratory symptoms, from airway inflammation to inflammation of the air sacs, and even a higher risk of developing lung cancer. So why this is actually happening was unclear. And that's what we have been studying in detail. And I just want to take you through a few experiments to show you how we investigate this. And to investigate how these microplastics affect our lungs, we make use of the stem cells in our lungs. We grow these into mini lungs, and these stem cells in our lungs are present to help us grow our lungs when we're children, or repair our lungs when they get damaged, for instance, when you have a viral infection. Now we can isolate these stem cells from human or mouse lung tissue and then add them to a culture dish and give them a lot of tender love and care. And then these cells grow out into structures that we also find in lung tissue, so airways and air sacs. And this process takes about 14 days. And during that time, we have added polyester or nylon fibers to see how that affected the growth of these structures. So the results were quite striking. While the growth of the air sacs was not really affected by either polyester or nylon, which you can see on the right-hand side of these graphs, the growth of airways was very much affected, both by polyester and nylon, but most so by nylon. And this suggests that these fibers impair the normal development or the repair processes of the lungs. But as I mentioned before, plastics contain additives. So when we get these results, we always question ourselves, is this the particle that's doing this, or is it something leaching from the particles? So to study this, we used a slightly different setup in our model and compared the cells where we have the fibers in close contact with the cells to a condition where we had the fibers and the cells separated. And we also had a condition where we made a fiber wash. So we let the fibers leach out stuff and we just used that wash to treat the cells with to see if all these conditions would yield the same results. So this was also very clear because it didn't matter how we treated the cells, either with the fibers in close contact or with the fibers far away or just with the fiber wash, they all inhibited the outgrowth of airways. So this suggests that in the case of nylon, chemicals leaching from the plastic are inhibiting airway growth. And then, of course, the key question is, what chemical is this? And we spent a lot of time and money trying to figure this out. And the take-home message is, we don't know yet. We tried many known things like the PFAS, the BPAs, the phthalates, etc., but they all didn't have the same effect. We had the wash examined, tried all different types of compounds. And it has proven to be very hard to find out. So that question is still out there. What is in that plastic that makes these airways not grow? So what are the implications of our findings? Since our mini lungs are a model of growing or repairing lungs, we think that children and people with lung disease are most at risk for potential harmful effects. However, it's all about the dose. And at the moment, we do not know how much plastic and which types of plastics people inhale. So we need to assess exposure levels. Otherwise, we can never estimate what would be safe levels. And not being able to find the chemical in nano makes me extra wary of recycling, besides the things Orska already mentioned. Because when you add all sorts of plastic together from different sources, you're making the mix even more complicated, and you don't know what you're hitting people with. So at the moment, we have no evidence that normal people inhale too many microplastics. If you're worried about this and you would want to help the world, what you can do is you reduce your plastic use and make sure that you ventilate your home and remove fibers by vacuum cleaning. So that could at least help protect yourself against potential negative effects of these microplastic fibers. Thank you very much for your attention, and please feel free to ask questions if any popped up.
That's wonderful, and I see some questions coming through. Just to encourage people to keep going with those questions, and we'll come to them right after the next speaker. Barbara, that was wonderful, very clear, but also very much alarming. And I'm really glad to be aware of some actions we can take as individuals, and not but and we know that, you know, this can't be resolved by individuals alone. And so with that in mind, we're going to go over now to Emily McIntosh and listen a little bit about this rather big question of regulation and legislative means to address the dependency on synthetics and the increase in the use of synthetics over time. Emily, can you hear us all right?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes, we can. And if anyone
Perfect.
can't, perhaps they can put in the chat, but sounds good.
I will share my
Fantastic.
presentation and share. I also had some technical difficulties, so if anyone, please just shout, Laura, if you suddenly can't hear me or anything. And then I need to go into presentation mode. Okay, I think we're good.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so nice to meet everyone here on the webinar today. My name is Emily. I work at the European Environmental Bureau. For those of you who don't know us, we're the largest network of environmental citizens groups, and I follow everything to do with textiles. So I'll just jump straight in. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about three main policy areas: eco-design, green claims, and the product environmental footprint and waste, and also the textile labeling regulation. But I'm going to zoom out a little bit first before going into the detail, to just take us back to the EU textile strategy. So sorry, to move the Zoom thing so I can see my slides. Yeah, so most of you on this call probably know that we have this non-legislative document. So the textile strategy regroups different initiatives that will affect the textile sector, but it itself is not a legislative initiative, and it was signed off by the Parliament in 2023. So I think what's important to take away about, for those of you who maybe don't know about the strategy, is that while it does have a good problem analysis, you can see on the box on the right hand side there, identifying overproduction, overconsumption as the problem. It largely looks to fix this through single market measures and fixing the product, and not looking at the bigger system in which the products are sold. And it's weak on social impacts as well. Yeah, I've also put the vision on the screen. I won't read it out, but just for your reference there. And the strategy covers all textile products essentially, but it does put specific reference on the garment sector, the clothing and apparel area. So yeah, that's just an overview of the different policies I want to look at today. So maybe I'll just go on to the next slide for time. So what I'm going to talk about is how microplastics are where the touch points for microplastics are in each of these files. So you may be thinking, is there a specific initiative or policy instrument looking at microplastics in textiles or microplastics in general? And the short answer is no. So there was, as I mentioned, for the whole strategy, a strong problem analysis in the strategy. Sorry, someone's shouting. There was a good problem analysis on microplastics, and Urshka already referenced this in her presentation. The textile strategy identified synthetics as the main source of unintentional release of microplastics, but there's a lack of clear policy action and a delay in a commitment. So the strategy did commit to have a specific initiative on a reduction of unintentionally released microplastics, and I just copied the paragraph here, which you can see in the strategy, the kinds of things that were potentially being considered. But ultimately this was watered down, and it was basically just a booklet with a page on overviewing what we already knew about EU action against microplastics. So then, while this has just been kind of shelved into this information booklet on microplastics, it remains to be seen with the new political cycle, whether the new commission, which will potentially have a Circular Economy Act, whether there will be a place for specific action on microplastics in the next political cycle. So now zooming back down to the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation. So I'll try not to go into too much of the detail, so I'll maybe skip over some slides just for time. But the ESPR, or Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, is a general framework. It doesn't lay down specific product rules, but it's the centerpiece of the EU's product policy framework. And the aim is to really get the worst products out of the market, and push them out the market. And it sets in an annex the different parameters which will be set for specific product categories. So durability, increasing recycled content, repairability, things like that. And then the specific rules for product groups, such as textiles, will be set in what's called delegated or implementing acts. Maybe I'll just skip over this slide. And here you can see a list of some of the performance requirements which will be applied to products. And you can see here on the right-hand side that microplastic release is identified as one of them. So, and here you have just a quick overview of how, because it remains to be seen how eco-design requirements would set specific requirements on microplastic release. And I think it's really interesting what Barbara just said about whether we're talking about fiber leaching or chemical leaching, because you also have a whole area of the ESPR which will look at substances of concern. But it's clear that additional policy instruments will be needed to tackle microplastic shedding and release across all life cycle stages. I think it's important to keep in mind the limitations of what eco-design requirements can set. And maybe I'll just go back a few slides, sorry, to this one, because there's what's called performance requirements and information requirements. So there will be product-specific requirements and horizontal requirements. And so that means that you'll have requirements which apply across the whole product category, so textiles or apparel. And then there's also scope to have specific requirements for more granular segmentation, more granular categorization of products. So it's probably a little bit confusing depending on how deep you are into the ESPR, but I'll just keep going. And then what's important to notice as well is that there's soon to be the second aspect of this work to set the requirements in the Delegated Act will start before the end of this year. So if you're interested in engaging in that topic, reach out to me and I can pass more information on to you. From our perspective as an NGO, we are a bit skeptical of the approach that the Joint Research Centre has taken, because they're really looking at the end product function and not at fibre and textiles as intermediary products. And so that means, yeah, they're looking at this. It's kind of hard. It's maybe too much to go into the detail, but what we recommend is to actually take the approach that is already set out in the EU Ecolabel. So you're probably all, if you're interested in this topic, aware of the product environmental footprint. So I won't over-explain what it is, but for those of you who don't know, it's a European Commission methodology which sets to harmonise life cycle analysis methodologies, which has lots of shortcomings, and particularly when it's applied to fibres and to textiles. And then there's a regulatory directive called the Green Claims Directive, which is currently being negotiated. And the whole sort of political controversy is to what extent the product environmental footprint method will be used to underpin the Green Claims Directive. So one of the main shortcomings of the method is the extent to which it doesn't deal with microplastics. So there has been some progress that microplastics will now appear as an additional information in the PEF score, but this is not good enough because it doesn't actually affect the overall PEF score. So while it is there is a risk that this doesn't really fix the problem of how the PEF calculates and favours synthetic fibres over other fibres. And a proposal from, I think it's on the next slide here, yeah, a proposal from civil society and other stakeholders to report the final fragmentation impact into each bill of materials was rejected, and instead there will be secondary data on average fibre fragment loss rates from using data from the Microfibre Consortium. So the key takeaway here is really that we need to have much more, we have to have the addition of different categories into the PEF method before it can be used to underpin, to substantiate green claims. So maybe, I'm not sure how much time because I can't see the clock, but I'm just going to quickly go through the last slide.
Just 1 minute, thanks, Emily.
Yes, so maybe I'll just skip over these. That was kind of setting the scene, but the Council position on Waste Framework Directive has some really good wording when it comes to eco-modulation. So basically, eco-modulation is a mechanism which could disincentivize, if it's set in an ambitious way, which could disincentivize synthetics or particular blends, which we identify as being particularly problematic in terms of microplastic shedding. So this is something that we hope that will be kept alive as the Waste Framework Directive, which sets the extended producer responsibility rules, goes into the next stage of negotiations. Sorry, that's it here. Yeah, it says that they call for fees to be eco-modulated in a way which takes into account the business practices which lead to overproduction and the premature disposal of clothing. So this part in blue here is wording from the Council position, which was adopted in June. So I think this is something the legislation is going in the right direction. Of course, it's all comes down to the detail and in the criteria, but this could be, I think that this to me is the most ambitious, even if it is not particularly ambitious, but it's the place where there is the most opportunity to potentially set some restrictions on synthetics through eco-modulation criteria as part of EPR. And then the very last point, I'll just skip right through to it, because this is maybe the easiest thing to as a nice takeaway as well. There will soon be a revision of the textile labeling regulation. The textile labeling regulation is an old piece of legislation from 2011, which sets the rules on the tags that you have in your labels in your clothes. It will be updated and modernized. And most of there's also an opportunity here, we think, from a civil society perspective, to advocate for synthetic and microplastic warnings on the labels. So this could also be a way to have a different market signal and for consumers, and also this would be something that would incentivize the use of different fibres. And here we are also advocating for the inclusion of production date marking on clothing through the textile labeling regulation. So in summary, I think it's really about how to make the most of the legislative opportunities there are when it comes to microplastics and synthetics, and situate them in an attempt to use the policy mechanisms to reduce production of across the board for textiles, and make sure that we have the right problem analysis. I think that's the last slide, and I hope that was clear, and sorry for having too many slides.
Thank you, Emily. I see some questions coming through as to whether you would be with sharing that presentation at some point. Yeah, because there is, it seems like, I mean, you've done a lot of work to pull this together, so that should be acknowledged, and that's brilliant. Maybe just to give you a chance also, because I rushed you there a little bit towards the end in the interest of getting to these questions, but maybe just one broader question to you, which is, imagine that I'm not from Europe, I'm from somewhere near the Nairobi River that was referred to earlier, and I'm not involved in EU policy. In 3 lines, how would you summarize how the EU is doing in terms of regulation on microplastics and textiles?
I think it's clearly not doing enough. And I think in terms of the global aspect, there also needs to be a bigger emphasis on impact assessments as to the socioeconomic impact of different policies on different parts of the value chain. And yeah, but I think, as I said in the presentation, there isn't a specific home for, there's not one piece of policy which is designed with a view to tackle synthetics or microplastics.
Right, thank you for that. I'm now looking to my colleagues, as there's many questions have been coming through, and we've got about 15 minutes before the close to take some of those. So I'm just going up to my chat where the questions are being channeled through to me from you as the participants. So Barbara, I'd like to go to you first. There's a question on research about what kinds of textile products or abrasion causes microplastic release indoors, and also what's the significance of line drying or tumble dryers? I think you may have spotted this question coming through. So over to you.
Yep. Thanks. I was trying to find a question in the Q&A to copy in some of the papers that I'm referring to. So there's basically this group in Switzerland who's looking at that I'm quoting in my presentation. So I don't think the question is in the Q&A. So if the person who asked the question puts it in the Q&A, I can give you the DOIs of the papers, and then you can look them up. And there are more. I know that also in the UK there's some research into how much clothes abrade and how much that contributes to fibers in the air.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Barbara. I am multitasking just now, trying to get the questions through. So this other question has come through here for Urška, and I am looking at, so this is from a microfiber PhD researcher at the University of Manchester, looking at design-led initiatives to reduce microfiber pollution and enjoyed this report, very much needed. I understand the focus on synthetics. However, on the part of the report, it stated that shifting to natural fibres was needed and that initiatives such as TMC that state that natural and semi-synthetics are just as bad are used as distraction for policymakers. However, as natural fibres are so heavily treated during processing and research is catching up on how their impacts are as bad as synthetics, it could lead to the same pollution in future. What do you think?
Yes, if you don't mind, I will, because there are two questions there for me, and I'll just try to answer them at the same time and keep it short, because there's also a question about what about cotton substitution and bamboo fiber substitution, and then this issue of shifting to natural fibers and the problem with the chemicals. So just on the first question that was there in the Q&A about what about cotton and bamboo. So yes, of course, like I said, there are environmental and social impacts with all fiber types. And when we look at the cotton, there's the pesticide, the water use, the land use, but there are ways to produce cotton in a responsible way. With bamboo as well. I'm not going to go into detail. We had a whole campaign on viscose, but if the deforestation side of it is addressed, making sure that the wood pulp or bamboo is not sourced from ancient endangered forests, that is not leading to deforestation, and that it's produced in a closed loop system where the chemicals are not released but recycled back into the process. Yes, there is a way also to produce viscose in a responsible way. But what makes synthetics inherently unsustainable is that they are made from fossil fuels, they are plastic-based fiber that are inherently non-biodegradable, and they are increasingly contributing to microplastic pollution. The point about the chemicals is really important, because it's true. This is a very important separate discussion that we have to have, because it's very crucial that we eliminate the synthetic dyes and the use of toxic chemicals in the use of our garments, because yes, they can affect the biodegradability and also then the toxicity of clothes themselves. But to use that as a way to say we should not do anything about synthetics, period, because there's also that problem, it is a delay and distract tactic. And we are not advocating to shift from synthetics to another material. You know, like the solution is not about switching from all synthetics to cotton. What we want to see is the general slowdown of fashion. And since this fast fashion model that is so destructive is so deeply rooted on the reliance of synthetics, we cannot actually slow it down unless we move away from synthetic fibers. But yeah, happy to also continue this discussion in an email or so.
Great, thank you, Urška. I'm going to go to Emily. Emily, there's a question here for you that states the following: it's evident that regulations are necessary to drive change, but their development and implementation lag behind. So in your opinion, instead of waiting for regulatory support, how can we shift our focus to actively supporting governments in accelerating these processes? What's your thoughts?
I'm not sure I understand the question. How can we shift our focus to actively supporting governments in the absence of speed on regulation? Yeah, I think it depends which actors you're talking about. I think there is. I can answer it from a perspective of kind of EU policymaking, I suppose. The example that I gave on the slides of the eco-modulation, which was it was a surprise that it was the wording was quite ambitious. This came from the initiative of four member states. So you can see the power of kind of different national governments if they have the political will to drive things forward, then that can create the impact at the national level. So it is about creating the conditions that allow front runner countries to be bold with their recommendations. I don't know if that's really what the question was referring to.
Yeah, I imagine it's specifically about implementation. And if not, we can always encourage the person to come back.
Please write in the chat if I've misunderstood.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to go also to Barbara with another question, and I have one here, which is, hello, I'm from Kenya and a nurse, and I was involved in the research in Nairobi with cleanup there. My question is, do we have research that can prove about microplastics particles in the human body?
Yes, we have actually. There are many studies coming out looking at this. So for the lung, there are at least 5 studies now showing that there's plastic in lung tissue, but recently there was a new paper showing in brain, in penis tissue, in heart tissue, guts. The list is becoming endless, and I have no reason to believe it's not everywhere actually in our body in some way or form.
Thank you for that, Barbara. I wonder if you could also answer this question. Can you briefly talk about your experiences and the current situation about methods for collecting plastic fibres? I'd be interested in the separation of natural fibres. Does that make sense to you?
If that is a question about how you make these fibers or how you collect them to use in research, then I have an answer.
Perhaps we can ask that person who is Viola from Exit Plastic, I think. So perhaps in the meantime, you could answer the other question here from the same person, which is, can you share any specific studies or sources on the health effects of textile fibers from your lecture and also others?
I did just copy in the link to my own paper. There are a few other studies using a similar model as we have used, looking at how these lung structures change when you add microplastics. So there's one other study from Italy that also uses polyester. And there's one study, if I remember correctly, from China that looked at rubber particles from tire wear. So that is the main type of plastic particles out in outdoor air. And they also find an increase in inflammation in these cells. And so generally taking up these particles leads to inflammatory responses in cells. And then there's a lot of other studies looking in more simple models, so 2D models we call them, how cells respond to that. But my biggest problem with all these studies is that most studies just add the particles to the cells, and look at inflammatory responses, and they said, oh yeah, it's inflammatory. But no, like almost nobody looks at whether is it the particle, is it something leaching from this particle, or is it the combination? And nobody looks at how this happens, what the mechanism is. That's my biggest peeve. I think the field needs to move on from just showing, yay, it's inflammatory, to why is it? What specific characteristic of the particle is causing this? And maybe that will help us to design better materials.
Yeah, you're getting some agreement there in the chat, Barbara. I'm going to take one last question, and I think it's for Emily. Emily, how long do you think it might take the EU to ban first and second-hand synthetics that's entering water and is emitted into the air, taking into account that this is a real ecological and health emergency? I guess, how long is a piece of string? But what do you think?
I think probably that's not, yeah, I don't think it's going to be happening anytime soon. Also, I think that banning isn't necessarily on the agenda. So I think we need to kind of look at it through some of the different ways. But I think, if the things that have just been outlined by Barbara and Nuska about the health impacts, I think the more they can be brought to the fore in policymaking, then that increases the political will to move towards meaningful measures beyond just kind of little pieces of nods to microplastic release.
Thank you for that. Folks, in the last couple of minutes before we close, I always like to do a participatory close off, and not to round off myself, but to ask each of you just to put into the chat, what's one thing you take away from this conversation? It can be an image, it can be a thought, it can be something you learned. But if you wouldn't mind just dropping into the chat your thoughts, and together we can then pull together what we take away from this hour. So let's take at least 30 seconds to think about that. So they're starting to come through. Proof of inflammation by microplastics. Ecological and health emergency that the circular economy isn't going to fix. Reduce private synthetics use even more. Microparticles will always leach into water. Thank you so very much. Issue of volumes together with synthetics, not about switching, but slowing down. We need quick action. Plastics should simply be banned from all clothing. Whoa, it's going too fast now. I go backwards. The legislation has to be implemented more quickly. If not, we'll have an end during lifetime. They need to know what specific aspect is causing inflammation, the fact that chemicals are problematic and causing inflammation. A reminder, there are safe ways to produce cotton, but none for synthetics. Still questions about health impacts on workers in garment manufacture. Thank you. That allows me to say, please do contact Changing Markets for any questions that didn't get answered. But at this point, I would just like to say thanks for helping us to really bring together the takeaways. Thank you to all the speakers who battled with technology and internet connections and did fantastically. But also to the team of Changing Markets, all the partners involved in writing this fantastic report. And all of you that turned up, I'd just like to ask you one thing, which is to share this report and maybe your takeaway that you've just put into the chat now on social media. And that would really give something back to those who have taken the time to really spend a lot of time to organize this event. Thank you so much. And I hope you'll keep an eye out for Changing Markets' next events via their social media